There's a very specific kind of confusion that slowly destroys a man from the inside. Not when a woman cheats openly, not when she leaves. Those things are painful, but at least they're honest. The real damage begins when she stays with you while keeping another man emotionally close enough to reach at any moment. Maybe she says he's just an old friend. Maybe she tells you they've known each other forever. Maybe his name only appears late at night, after arguments, during lonely moments, or in those strange emotional gaps where she suddenly feels distant for reasons she can't explain. And every time you notice it, you start questioning yourself instead of questioning the situation. You wonder if you're insecure, possessive, overthinking. But deep down, something inside you keeps whispering the same uncomfortable truth. A woman doesn't keep her ex on speed dial for no reason. The question is whether that connection comes from unresolved pain, emotional dependency, unfinished validation, or something far more manipulative. Because once you understand what her ex really represents in her emotional world, you stop reacting blindly and start seeing the relationship clearly for the first time. If you've ever felt like you were competing with a ghost from her past while pretending everything was normal, subscribe and stay close. And tell me in the comments if you've ever heard the words, "You don't have to worry about him," right before discovering you actually did. Most men make the mistake of treating her ex like a simple character from her past. An old chapter, a closed door, a finished story, and that misunderstanding is exactly why so many men stay trapped in relationships that quietly drain their confidence without ever understanding why. Because when a woman keeps her ex close enough to reach emotionally at any moment, you are no longer dealing with history. You are dealing with access. That's the part almost nobody explains correctly. The danger is not automatically that she still loves him. Sometimes she doesn't. Sometimes she would never sleep with him again. Sometimes she genuinely believes she has moved on. But emotional attachment does not disappear just because physical intimacy ended. A man can stop being her boyfriend while still remaining her emotional escape hatch. And if you fail to understand the difference, you'll keep reacting to symptoms while missing the real structure underneath the relationship. Women rarely hold on to emotional connections without a reason. Men tend to separate more cleanly. A relationship ends, and eventually the emotional file gets archived. Women often carry emotional threads much longer than they admit, especially when the relationship involved intense validation, instability, heartbreak, or unfinished emotional business. That old connection can quietly become a place she revisits whenever her current relationship stops making her feel emotionally secure, emotionally desired, or emotionally understood. And before some man listening to this swings too far in the other direction, let me say something important. Not every woman keeping contact with an ex is secretly cheating. Not every message is betrayal. Not every memory is manipulation. But pretending it means nothing is just another form of self-deception men use to avoid uncomfortable truths. Because whether she realizes it consciously or not, a woman does not keep emotional access open to a man who has become completely irrelevant to her inner world. That's why your instincts start whispering long before you have proof of anything. You feel the strange hesitation when his name appears. You notice the emotional shift after certain conversations. You watch her become protective in ways that don't match the innocent explanation she's giving you. And slowly, almost without noticing, you begin editing yourself to avoid looking insecure while your nervous system keeps sounding the alarm anyway. A woman's past is not the threat. The threat begins when her past still has emotional permission to enter the present whenever she feels uncertain, lonely, angry, or emotionally hungry. That's when another man stops being a memory and starts becoming an active part of your relationship, whether anyone says it out loud or not. Emotional attachments rarely survive by accident. That's the first thing men need to understand. When a woman keeps an ex close enough to call, text, vent to, or emotionally revisit during vulnerable moments, there is usually a psychological function underneath that connection. And most of the time, the function matters far more than the man himself. One reason women keep former partners emotionally nearby is familiarity. Human beings are drawn toward what feels emotionally familiar, even when it once hurt them, especially women who spent years emotionally attached to someone unstable, emotionally intense, or deeply validating. The relationship may have exhausted her, but it also shaped her nervous system. She learned his patterns, learned his emotional language, learned how to predict his reactions. So even after the breakup, part of her still experiences him as emotionally known territory. And when her current relationship feels uncertain, stressful, or emotionally cold, her mind naturally drifts back toward what already feels mapped out inside her. That's why some women reconnect with exes during periods of emotional discomfort. Not necessarily because they want the man back, but because uncertainty in the present awakens emotional habits from the past. Old attachments become emotional muscle memory. Familiar pain starts feeling safer than unfamiliar peace. Another layer underneath this behavior is emotional backup. This is where things become more dangerous for the current relationship. Some women keep exes emotionally available because they never fully learned how to emotionally stand alone. They need reassurance somewhere at all times. So instead of processing loneliness internally or working through tension directly with their current partner, they quietly maintain emotional safety nets in the background. A text here, a check-in there, a conversation after a fight. Little emotional escape valves that allow them to avoid fully investing in the present relationship emotionally. And the man listening to this usually senses it before he can explain it. He notices that after arguments, her energy shifts somewhere else emotionally. He feels that part of her attention is no longer inside the relationship. The emotional intimacy starts leaking outward in tiny invisible ways long before anything obvious happens physically. Then there's the part women almost never admit openly. Validation. Some women do not keep exes around because they want reconciliation. They keep them around because they still want access to the feeling of being wanted by them. There is something intoxicating about knowing a man from your past would still answer if you reached out. It reassures her that her emotional influence still exists, that she still matters, that she still has power over someone who once loved her deeply. And this is where men become dangerously naive. They think faithfulness only exists at the physical level. Meanwhile, emotional dependency quietly keeps growing underneath the surface until the relationship starts carrying 3 people emotionally instead of 2. A woman does not need to secretly sleep with another man for him to become a threat to your relationship. Sometimes all he needs is emotional access during the moments when she no longer feels fully anchored to you. The moment a woman keeps an ex emotionally nearby, something else quietly begins happening underneath the surface. She starts watching you, not always consciously, not always maliciously, but she watches how stable you remain once another man's shadow enters the room emotionally, and this is where most men lose themselves. A woman mentions her ex casually, and suddenly the entire emotional atmosphere changes inside the man. His mind starts racing. He begins decoding tone, timing, body language, pauses, little emotional shifts that never used to bother him before. Then the questions begin. Who texted first? How often do they talk? Why does she still care? Why didn't she mention this earlier? Why does she get defensive every time his name comes up? At first, the man believes he's protecting the relationship, but slowly, something much darker happens. He starts competing with a ghost. That's the trap. Because once you emotionally enter competition with another man from her past, you stop standing inside your own value. Your emotional center shifts away from yourself and attaches directly to her reactions. Her reassurance becomes your oxygen. Her silence becomes your panic. Her defensiveness becomes your obsession. And without realizing it, you hand another man emotional power over your state of mind without him ever needing to touch your relationship physically. Women notice this immediately, especially emotionally intelligent women. A woman can feel the difference between a man who calmly observes something concerning and a man who emotionally collapses the second uncertainty enters the room. One feels grounded, the other feels afraid of being replaced, and ironically, fear of replacement often creates the exact emotional instability that makes a woman start pulling away emotionally in the first place. That does not mean you ignore your instincts. It does not mean you pretend to be the cool guy while your intuition screams at you every night. Men destroy themselves doing that too. Real masculine stability is not emotional numbness. It is emotional control combined with clear perception. A centered man notices the emotional inconsistency without turning into a detective. He does not beg for reassurance. He does not interrogate her phone like an investigator building a criminal case. He does not launch into emotional speeches trying to prove why he deserves loyalty more than her ex did. He simply pays attention. That's the difference. Weak men either explode or suppress. Grounded men observe. And once a woman realizes her behavior can emotionally destabilize you, another dangerous dynamic begins forming. She may not even intend it consciously, but your emotional reactions slowly teach her where your insecurities live. Then every mention of the ex starts carrying emotional weight far beyond the actual situation itself. The second you begin competing with her past, you unknowingly place yourself beneath it. Because now your identity is no longer standing on your own foundation. It's standing on whether she chooses to emotionally reassure you enough to feel safe again. Comment center if you've ever stayed silent about something that bothered you because you were afraid of looking insecure. A relationship changes the moment a man finally stops asking himself what she feels and starts paying attention to what she respects. Because attraction can survive uncertainty for a while. Chemistry can survive emotional confusion. But respect almost never survives a man abandoning his own boundaries just to avoid losing a woman. This is where many men misunderstand what strength actually looks like. The weak man becomes controlling. He panics. He demands access to her phone. He starts policing every interaction. Every male friend becomes a threat. Every delayed reply becomes a crisis. His fear takes over the relationship, and eventually the woman starts feeling emotionally smothered. But the opposite extreme is just as destructive. Some men try so hard to appear emotionally secure that they betray their own instincts completely. They watch behavior that clearly violates their comfort, then smile through it because they're terrified of looking jealous, insecure, or toxic. So instead of standing on principles, they perform emotional tolerance while resentment quietly poisons them underneath. Neither man is grounded. A centered man does something much calmer, much simpler. He speaks clearly. He doesn't say, "You're not allowed to talk to him." That's control. And control always comes from fear. What he says instead is something far more powerful. He says, "I don't build serious relationships with women who keep emotional doors open with exes." Do you see the difference? One statement tries to control her choices, the other simply defines his standards. That distinction matters more than most men realize. A woman learns everything about a man from what happens after he expresses a boundary. Not the boundary itself, the aftermath. That's where the truth lives. Does he crumble the second she pushes back emotionally? Does he immediately soften his standards because she gets upset? Does he start apologizing for having expectations? Does he abandon his own discomfort just to restore temporary peace? Women notice that instantly, and women also reveal themselves instantly during these moments. A woman who genuinely respects the relationship may feel defensive at first, but eventually she becomes thoughtful. She understands that emotional transparency matters. She adjusts because protecting the relationship matters more to her than protecting emotional access to another man. A different kind of woman reacts very differently. She calls you insecure before she ever addresses the behavior itself. She becomes more protective of the ex than protective of your peace of mind. She hides details instead of clarifying them. She deletes messages instead of creating trust. She frames every concern you raise as emotional weakness instead of honestly asking herself why another man still occupies so much emotional space in her life. Pay attention to that carefully, because once a woman starts attacking your standards, instead of discussing the issue itself, the conversation is no longer about healing trust. It becomes about preserving leverage. This is the part many men are not emotionally prepared to hear. A woman who truly wants to build a peaceful future with you will not need endless convincing to close unnecessary emotional doors from the past. She may struggle. She may hesitate, but she will understand the importance of emotional clarity. A boundary does not reveal whether a woman likes you. It reveals whether she respects you enough to stop keeping one foot emotionally positioned toward another exit. Some women keep an ex emotionally nearby because they are wounded. Others keep him nearby because it gives them power. Confusing those two women is where many good men lose years of their lives. A wounded woman may still have emotional habits tied to her past. She may struggle with attachment. She may occasionally revisit old emotional patterns during moments of fear or loneliness, but when confronted honestly and calmly, she eventually reflects. She becomes aware of the damage. She starts protecting the relationship instead of protecting the emotional loophole. A manipulative woman behaves very differently. She notices that the existence of another man destabilizes you emotionally, and instead of reducing that instability, she quietly uses it. Sometimes subtly, sometimes deliberately. Suddenly, the ex appears in conversations at strangely convenient moments. During arguments, she mentions how he used to understand her better. When you create distance, she becomes emotionally unavailable while staying strangely active online with him. If you pull back, she pulls his presence closer, not because she wants him more necessarily, but because triangulation gives her leverage. That word matters. Leverage. Once another man becomes a tool she can emotionally activate whenever the relationship stops going her way, you are no longer dealing with unresolved feelings alone. You are dealing with power dynamics, and most men don't recognize it while it's happening. They think they just need to love harder, stay calmer, be more patient, prove they're different from the ex, so they start monitoring themselves constantly. They walk carefully, speak carefully, react carefully. Every disagreement starts feeling dangerous because somewhere in the back of their mind lives the fear that another man is emotionally waiting in reserve. That kind of relationship slowly destroys masculine stability. You stop feeling chosen. You start feeling replaceable. There's a reason this dynamic affects men so deeply psychologically. Masculine trust is built through emotional certainty. A man needs to feel that when conflict enters the relationship, the woman turns toward the relationship to solve it, not outward toward another source of validation. The moment she consistently seeks emotional comfort outside the relationship instead of repairing connection inside it, emotional intimacy starts breaking down from underneath. And manipulative women understand this far more than men think. Some women intentionally keep exes emotionally active because it increases their perceived value. It creates competition energy. It keeps the current man slightly anxious, slightly off balance, slightly afraid of losing her. That fear often makes him overperform. He becomes more attentive, more compliant, more emotionally dependent on her approval. Meanwhile, she quietly gains more emotional control over the entire relationship dynamic. Listen carefully to this part. A woman using her ex as emotional leverage is not preserving love. She is preserving optionality. She wants the emotional benefits of commitment while still keeping psychological access to alternative sources of validation, reassurance, or control. And the most dangerous part is that she will often frame your discomfort as insecurity instead of honestly acknowledging the emotional triangle she keeps feeding underneath the surface. When a woman uses her past to control your present, the issue is no longer healing. The issue becomes power. At some point, every man facing this situation arrives at the same crossroads. He either